Hi, everybody. We'll give people a couple more minutes to get in. I see some folks coming in, which is great. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. One thing as we're waiting for some more folks to come in, if you want to just open up the chat in the Zoom link and let us know who you are and where you're coming from and maybe a little bit of your interest in this topic.
All right. All the cool peeps are coming in. Cool.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started.
Awesome.
So again, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. My name is Liz Radzicki. I'm an education specialist with Participate. And we are so honored to have with us one of our just favorite partners, UNITAS, represented by Andrea Powell tonight. Just want to do a little bit of kind of norm setting housekeeping for where we're at tonight. We've got a chat that you can share some thoughts in. We have there, if you hover over the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A too. So as questions come up, and we hope they do, go ahead and pop the questions into the Q&A so that then after sort of Andrea's presentation, we can go through those and talk about the things you're curious about. The other thing is, I just want to say, we're all at home. We all have small people that we're taking care of. We all have animals that we're taking care of. Bigger people we're taking care of. And so if life happens in the middle of this, that it might happen. You might actually see my daughter or my husband coming through here. So I just wanted to kind of norm set that's okay, and we're all people. And then the other thing I wanted to say too is, and Andrea, I might actually let you talk about this as just sort of kind of doing some self-care as we talk through this.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is this topic this evening, sextortion, can be a heavy topic. I work with survivors, on a daily basis, and this issue's been close to my heart, particularly human trafficking and sextortion, sex trafficking for like 15 years. So sometimes it impacts me differently than someone who's just coming to the table to talk about it. But if you need a break, if you're just feeling overwhelmed, there's too much, don't be ashamed. It just makes you a human. You can take a break, you can walk away, you can exit the conversation, you can message me or Liz after. We are going to have materials that we're going to be sharing with the whole group. You can also reach out later if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, there's a kid or there's someone in my class or someone in my life who I think has been through this, or it resonates with something in your personal life. You can also speak with me about that. But this is a safe, non-judgmental space that you are welcome to come in and out of as you will and as you are. And that's just the most important thing. As we're talking about this issue later on, we're going to be speaking to the fact that non-judgment and open communication are key to combating this, because those who extort people, I don't know if sextortionist is a word yet, but I'm going to make it happen. Sextortionists try to manipulate people through isolation and control. So we here tonight are all about open, inclusive, non-judgmental space. So that's it.
And thank you for that, Andrea. And so, yeah, so Andrea, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about your role at and the organization UNITAS and kind of get us set up, and then we can move into actually taking a look at some of the material that you brought for us.
Awesome. So we've got quite a bit of material to go through, so I won't spend too much time on this, but I am the Director of Survivor and Youth Engagement at UNITAS. We are a nonprofit who I like to call us the pre-crime unit. So we are designed to work to prevent the trafficking and exploitation of young people. We want to reach kids before traffickers do. And so this comic series, and this one in particular, is very close to my heart. I worked with this fantastic comic artist, Dan Goldman, out of LA, who's sequestered with his kids and could not join us. But he and I worked together to develop this comic and many others that are designed to educate people about different forms of human trafficking. They're all based on the lived experiences of survivors. So I wrote a short story for each of the comics that would be then the source material for Dan to create the comic. But it is very much designed to reach kids and reach parents and families where they're at. And so each of the comics walks you through how a kid is exploited, what happens, and then what are the things that gets them out? You know, what is their inner strength, their inner, resiliency? Who did they need to help them along the way to recover, to get support? And so that's sort of the background. UNITAS also goes into classrooms and talks to kids there. And up until a month ago, we were about to walk into DC and New York public schools. But now obviously we are finding other ways to engage. And so we had this idea that we would take the comics and break them down in a very systematic way so that we could educate all of you in a virtual way. And this comic was the first comic that we chose because, as you know, over 30 million kids in the United States are out of school. Many of these kids are vulnerable. In New York alone, 1 in 10 New York City public school kids are homeless. So those kids are home, are on the streets, they're online, they're unsupervised, they're looking for connection, they're looking for safety, things are unstable, and many of them are dealing with situations where their parents are understandably overwhelmed. And so while all of that's going on, the conversation that I have not seen happening in the media is there are predators and there are traffickers, not just in the US, but globally, who are aware of the situation. They're taking advantage. And I'm not here to scare the crap out of you, but maybe like a little bit, because I think we need to understand this issue so that we can talk to our kids about it in a safe and truly empowering way. So that's my overview. I'm ready to get started with the slides, Liz, if you don't have anything else. All right, so I'm a learner for Zoom, so hold on just 1 second. I've learned, I'm gonna go up to this here, start share, and then I'm gonna go here, and then I'm going to say, I'm so close, guys, so close. All right, how does that look? Did I do it? No? Liz?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay.
Yeah, that looks great.
Right.
Looks
Liz
exactly
is like my
as it should.
emotional support human for this.
I'll take that. And I do want to remind people, as Andrea's going through this, again, throw your questions in the Q&A. Any comments, any things that are like really hitting you, throw in the chat. But we want this to be as interactive as it can be.
Awesome. All right, so here we go. All right, so this is BFF. And I'm not going to read the slides because I'm hoping that you can, but so we have Reiley here, the girl with the red hair. She is a young teenage girl in high school, and her best friend, Evie, they were inseparable, doing photography classes, super artsy. Evie moves away. And so that's sort of like the first little thing I want to point out is that isolation. As a fun side note, Evie is actually, her character is actually based on one of my best friends who was talking to me one night about her life and a story of another teenager who was assaulted. She felt like she didn't do enough to help. And as I was listening to the story, I started writing it down the way that writers do. And then when she went to bed, I wrote this comic. differently because Reiley's based on a survivor, but I needed this hook with another character. So Evie is based on my friend Rebecca. Going to the next slide. So we dig a little bit deeper into some of the risk factors when you're looking at Reiley. I mean, she obviously looks distressed. She talks about how girls at her school are terrible. They drag her, which for old people, that means they're making fun of her online. She doesn't feel like anyone's got her back. They're making fun of her. And she has these dreams, though. She has these dreams of being a photographer, going to Paris, getting out of town, starting her life in a different way. And I think we can all kind of resonate with that, at least for me. Like, I'm from a small town and was kind of bullied as a kid. So all this is kind of, you know, what a lot of us have faced, whether we're older and it didn't happen online or we're younger and it did. That's sort of Reiley's risk factors. All right, so we're moving to the next slide. You know, Reiley's young, she's having fun, she's probably online. A lot of you know, like, you can join like Facebook groups about different causes, or Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, you know, kids are always evolving. And so this Andy character, as you can see his name up the top, sees that she's creative, and he writes, "Creative is the new beautiful." So what I want to speak to about that is grooming tactics. So sexual predators are skilled, it's their art form to really identify what are your vulnerabilities, what is a young person looking for and needing. Reiley's already clearly stated that she's a creative, she's an artist. And then he also drops he's been to Paris, which, you know, as we're reading this, we're all thinking BS, right? But if you're a kid who is feeling desperate and feeling alone, like, it just feels like a lifeline. So he messages her and they start talking, and it all seems kind of pretty innocuous. I mean, I know kids as young as 8 who are messaging people who they don't really know online, and we'll talk about why that is such not a good idea later. Okay, so here we have an interesting shift, and I am going to read this part. When he confessed he was 23, not 16, I knew I couldn't tell mom and dad. So let me tell you a little bit about how predators work, be they a sex trafficker, be they a different type of sexual predator. They're looking to create a secret, a bond. So they're bonding their young victim by saying, like, oh, you know, I have this secret, I hate to tell you this, or I'm sorry that I didn't tell you this, but can you help me out? And so it does a couple of things. One, it makes the victim feel special, like, oh, they trust me, and I know this information and no one else does. And it does another thing too. If that young person keeps that secret, they don't walk away, they don't tell an adult, it shows that they're willing to stick around. It shows that they're hooked. And so that is where the grooming kicks in really deep. So this slide's actually super important. The next thing is Reiley says, hey, when can we meet in person? But they're trading photos, you know, she's really interested in him. And she has this vibe, if you look down at the bottom, it was weird that he wouldn't FaceTime. Well, so she's having this gut instinct that something's not right. And we all have, right? But we're often told, particularly, like, don't listen to that. Like, that's no big deal. And maybe there's this opportunity, and maybe he can help. And maybe this is the right guy. So, like, why are you, you know, questioning things? And so here we have him bonding her with a secret. And then her feeling like something's not right, but she can't put her finger on it, and she decides to ignore it. Next thing you know, he's complimenting her on how, you know, pretty she is, which, again, the kids back before at school are telling her she's ugly and too tall and blah, blah, blah. So now she's feeling like, okay, I'm attractive, he believes in me, and she's an artist, right? So photography is her art. So he's kind of tapped into that and gotten her thinking, like, I can use that to share photos. Now, not every kid, not most kids who are experiencing sextortion will have that background, but, you know, for the purposes of this story, we wanted to talk about how an exploiter might manipulate the best parts of a kid. So they're not just looking to take advantage, they're looking to destabilize them in a space where they actually previously felt good about themselves. Because Reiley didn't feel good at school, she didn't feel pretty, but she felt good as an artist, and he used that. So this is where things start to get deep. Now she says he's not talking to her, he just wants sexier and sexier photos. She finally kind of like has enough. But he starts to threaten her and says he's got all of her photos. And she realizes at this point, something's really, really wrong. And that instinct, that feeling of like something's really, really wrong hits a lot of kids. There's a 2017 study by an organization called Thorn that talks about the fact that less than 50% of kids actually go to try to get help when they're being sextorted or exploited online. And that's because it's hard to understand that slippery slope for a young person, or really anyone, of when do you say no? When do you stop? When do you get help? It's like one brick after a time comes in front of you until you just got this wall in front of you. And you can see Reiley's feeling that wall of shame and fear closing in around her. So now we're kind of moving into a different space. She's starting to isolate, which is a very key indicator. If you're working with young people or have young people at home, when they start pulling away that there's a problem. So she forgets about applying to an art program in Paris. She's stressed out. This isn't in the comic, but in the story, she starts slipping in school. She's feeling a lot of shame. She doesn't tell her mom and dad, which you might have expected, but she doesn't even tell her best friend, Evie, who's really the one person in her life she tells everything to, because she's feeling like fear, shame. She doesn't know what to do. And those feelings of isolation are really what traffickers and exploiters are depending upon for their victims. And so it's important to start to look at some of those red flags of someone who's, not engaging the normal way they should, constantly checking their phone, trying to stay in their room, not doing the things that they used to enjoy. And obviously a lot of these things might be indicative, particularly right now, of depression, like a lot of things that could be going on. But when you combine all of that together, all these different indicators, it's important to ask those questions, to say, I've noticed that you're not yourself right now, and I'm concerned about you. I care about you. Please talk to me if you feel like you need help. And I'm gonna kind of beat this over the head a lot, but that non-judgment, open communication, and honestly asking the direct questions in a loving way is really important. It's not just about like, hey, is something going on? Like something's messed up. It's saying like, I've noticed something seems different, and I'm concerned, and I care about you, and reiterating that, because anyone, but particularly a young person, may not respond very well to that right off the bat, but a consistent, loving, non-judgmental approach potentially will open those doors. And we're going to talk a little bit about internet safety later, because I think there's probably one or two in the audience is like, I just want to get into that computer and figure out what's going on and my kid's being hurt. And we'll get to that in a minute. But that psychosocial support is also like really important to build trust and communication. And as you can see later in this post, he starts to basically switch the script. No longer is he saying she's beautiful and amazing. He's calling her fat and a slut, and just really shifting gears. So we move to the next slide. She's feeling alone. She feels like she has to keep her webcam on all the time. So he's watching her. And that gets to one of my tips around computers. A lot of times kids, particularly younger kids, they don't realize that they're being recorded when they're playing a lot of these live games. And so it's important to make sure that that's concealed. It can literally just be a piece of tape. I firmly believe that it's okay to be nosy. You're not there to be your kid's best friend. You're there to be a parent. So talking to your kids about internet safety and taking proactive action to conceal that recorder is really important. So in this post, she starts saying how she's checking out his name, his phone number. She's trying to figure out who he is. And then she realizes, or at least she thinks, he's watching and able to see what she's doing online. And that's potentially possible as well. So her fears are legitimate. So now we get into, what does he actually want? People who engage in sextortion can have a variety of interests. It can be their own personal sexual gratification. It can be financial. It can be purely just abuse. But increasingly, we're seeing situations where online sexual exploitation is directly connected to live camming and ways for the exploiter to make money and to trade the images and trade the videos. It's very hard for for law enforcement to sometimes find those who purchase these videos, purchase those images, because a lot of this stuff is disappearing. It's moving off computers. It's not impossible, but it is certainly a crime that is much harder to go after, particularly the more and more you have, you know, apps like TikTok and Snapchat where a lot of this stuff is disappearing. So in this slide, he actually stops and says, hey, you know, you're going to have to start having like live cam sex with other people. And that's what you're going to do to make money and to get me to leave you alone, to start, you know, leaving you alone about these images. So we end this portion of the series with guys messaging in, Andy saying, do your job, and Reiley's best friend, Evie, saying, are you okay? Talk to me. And so it could have ended like that. In fact, less than 50% of kids who go through this actually get help. So that means that less than 50% of kids are really accessing the services that potentially could be available. And that personally makes me really sad. But here at UNITAS, we wanted to talk about a pathway to get out. This is not everybody's journey, but this is the journey of the survivor with whom I worked and whose story we're telling. So we're going to move on. So here she is. She's laying on the bed. She's worried. Her best friend writes, are you mad at me? And they start talking. And I am fully aware this is one text-heavy comic slide. But as you see, as you break it down, Evie convinces her, like, this guy's illegal. He's in the wrong. They start opening up and talking about both of them are going through a lot. And this is my favorite line of the whole comic, where Evie says, ghost perv, or so telling the police, I'm over Andy or whoever he is. And that's our first indication that this guy that Reiley's been talking to may not actually be the person she's communicating with, or persons. And I also think it's really important that Evie calls him out as a pedophile, because oftentimes we talk about sex trafficking and sextortion, we're talking about minors, we don't make the link between that and pedophilia. And I think it's really important to understand this crime is deep and vast and has terminology that's very important. So Evie, who's a badass, and her mom drive together to meet Reiley and have a plan to help her tell her parents and get help. So now we're moving into Reiley and Evie talking. Evie's super woke. She clearly went to the UNITAS anti-trafficking curriculum, just saying. She talks about how guys are tricking girls into these situations, getting them to send sexy photos, and she actually labels it sextortion. Meanwhile, though, Reiley is absorbing that information, but she's so scared of what Andy's going to do, because for her, the bullying and the isolation is so real, and she just is terrified of what her dad is going to see, what her parents are going to see, what her friends are going to see. And that terror, that isolation, even though you might have great parents, it's very real for anyone, kids or adults. So we move into the next slide, and, you know, Reiley's telling her parents, and she's so scared they're going to be upset, but instead they're angry at this, you know, Andy character instead of, and her. But they're waiting for the police. They're waiting to get involved. I wanted to note, I do a lot of work with law enforcement, and I'm going to give you some resources at the end. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Human Trafficking Hotline are two ways that you can reach out to talk about a potential sextortion situation and get connected to the law enforcement officials who are specifically working on child endangerment, specifically working on trafficking cases. And that sometimes can be a great alternative to just specifically calling 911, because you might have an opportunity to connect with a detective or an officer who has training on these issues, and more around the country. There are task forces and their initiatives to make sure law enforcement understand these issues and are a part of the solution. It's definitely a work in progress, but I've seen a lot of really positive results. So we're going to move on. So these two detectives, one of whom looks suspiciously like Scully from the X-Files, but we won't get into that. They're there talking about, you know, what's going on. They're taking notes, they're getting information. If you find yourself in a situation where there is an interview like this, it can be really scary, particularly for a young person. But I want to point out that with the right detective, with the right environment, as scary as it is, there's a potential for not only helping your kid and helping yourself be safe, but the potential to keep other kids safe. So, and this is where we went a little Hollywood, although I've been in a situation like this, so it does happen. But the detectives try to get Reiley to chat with Andy so they can get his IP address. He's threatening her. He's telling her to just do what he needs to do. She gets off. The detectives say that she does a good job. But here, you know, she has real fear. What if he posts the pictures? She says you don't know what it's like to be a girl at my school. Everyone thinks I'm ugly and stupid. The detectives are trying to support her. She's already got her parents' support, Evie's mom, but it's a huge emotional toll. Over 60% of kids who've been sextorted in this 2017 Thorne study talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, eating disorders. Just because it happens online and the body isn't actually touched doesn't mean that the trauma and the devastation isn't real. Every single time that a child's photo is shared, a sexualized photo of a child is shared, it is abuse and it's exploitation. So here, and we're almost at the end, the FBI lady, as Reiley calls her, convinces her that there might be an organization that helps kids who've been exploited, helps kids who've been through the things that she's been through. And this is also one of my favorite slides. I have, in my past life, worked with a number of drop-in centers and organizations that provide direct services to survivors. And what we have here is she's walking in and she's finding other kids like her who've been exploited, who've been through difficult times. And they are meeting and they're sharing and they're connecting. And actually the other two girls in that comic story are two other girls in our comic series, Lucinda, who's sitting down, and Lacey, who's standing up. But part of UNITAS's vision is we are trying to build a community of survivor stories that can weave together and really tell the entirety of the issue of trafficking. And so I want to close, because that's our last slide, to say that, you know, this comic is not indicative of every sextortion story. It's not indicative of every sex trafficking story. It is designed to really elicit what are some of the core underlying challenges that we face as trying to identify issues, what are some challenges that kids face, and then what are ways that kids and families can get help. And I'm going to stop my share now so we can all connect again, and then we'll keep talking. All right. Yay, there you are, Liz. I was like, where is she? Oh God.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I remember the first time that when we were still in the office, when we saw those a couple of those comics, it's so powerful to tell stories that way. I'm going to give folks just a couple minutes to kind of sit with that, and again, invite you to share some questions, either about sort of the process of creating these comics, a little bit more about UNITAS's work, some of the, you know, or to learn more about the issue of human trafficking and exploitation.
Totally.
Yeah, so we'll give people a couple minutes. I know I have a million questions, but I will I will yield the floor to other attendees.
Awesome. I probably like questions for myself, but I'm going to hold those.
Maybe as people are thinking and getting their thoughts together, Andrea, if you could share a little bit of an overview of the issue of human trafficking and exploitation. I think throughout you've kind of talked about sort of the impact on individuals and on families, but I think also just maybe a little bit of a macro picture, so we understand the big picture of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say question from Sarah, so we'll follow up with that after. So, you know, human trafficking at its core is based on two fundamental things. The first is people who are vulnerable, and the other is people who want to exploit that vulnerability for money. So when you're talking about kids like Reiley, when you're talking about young people, when you think about vulnerability, you're thinking about the fact that over 70% of kids who are in trafficking situations or previously in the child welfare system, they've experienced abuse, they've experienced neglect. 1 in 3 kids who are homeless or run away are approached by an exploiter in the first 48 hours that they leave home. Over 70% of the kids I've worked with 1,500 kids who've been trafficked. Over 70% experienced domestic violence and poverty before they were trafficked. Over 90% experienced sexual abuse before they were trafficked. And so I like to think of I don't like, but I think of trafficking as the bad icing on an already horrible cake. And so traffickers themselves, people often think of like that movie Taken, where it's like this huge international syndicate and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's possible, but honestly, traffickers often mirror the life experiences of their victims. That's how they gain access. That's how they gain control and gain that sense of trust. Here in the District of Columbia, there was a study by the Urban Institute that an average trafficker, street trafficker selling, kids or adults for sex, is making $11,000 a week untaxed. You break that down, the fact that each sex act is about $100. So you're looking at a trafficked victim being forced to engage in sex 5, 10 to 15 times a night, night after night after night. And so people often have this, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just go to the police? But if you've been psychologically tormented, it's hard to know who to trust. If you've experienced bad things with law enforcement in the past, you may not trust those good law enforcement officers who are standing in front of you trying to get help. There's a detective I work with here in DC who's one of my favorite humans, and he talks about one of his first cases, how you'd see this young girl teetering in high heels just 2 blocks from the White House, constantly walking in these skimpy clothes. It was wintertime. And he kept trying to talk with her and she wouldn't talk. She was too scared. And finally, one day he went to McDonald's and got a bag of French fries and just sat there with them. And she was too hungry to say no. She was too hungry to get help. And traffickers tell their victims that no one else will provide for you. No one else will care what you want. No one else is going to understand or believe you. But in those moments where intervention and help happens, it's when we show a young person that we can be that trusted adult, that we can really show them that we have those needs. But, the numbers are hard to understand, how many kids are being trafficked. People often have that question. I don't know, but I do know that with my small organization of 4 people for over 10 years, we were identifying over 150 people, kids, mainly girls, a year. And we were just at the tip of the iceberg. There are over 250,000 homeless kids in the US every year, and it's probably going to get worse given this pandemic. So if you have 250,000 homeless kids a year, and 1 in 3 kids who are homeless or runaway are approached by a trafficker within the first 48 hours of leaving home, we're talking about a lot of people. Talking about a lot of kids. And so the issue is really deep and really dark, but the internet and why we chose this story, I think is really resonates with me, because you're not just seeing those so-called at-risk kids, kids on the streets, kids in the welfare system. A kid from any family and any background, kids as young as 6, can be playing games online and suddenly find themselves thinking they're playing with a friend or a new romantic interest, and really it's a trafficker. And I'm not here to like scare everybody into nightmares for the next month, but it is important to understand the magnitude of the issue and the fact that addressing it means really deeply understanding the root fundamental causes. Too much.
Thank you. I'm gonna move to Sarah's question. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the process, how you decided to go with this format of comics in general? And then also, I don't know if it was evident from the way that was presented, but these are on Instagram as stories you can kind of scroll through. And so how did you decide on that format and the materials, and how have people kind of both received them and also shared them?
So I personally have never been like a comics person, although I love like Jessica Jones and like all those like Marvel shows. But I have to give credit to Dan Goldman, our comic artist, and Lamont Hebert, who may or may not be on this call from UNITAS, and some other colleagues of mine there who had the idea that if we want to reach young people, let's use the social media platforms that traffickers use for ill, let's use them for good. Let's actually flip the script and use social media to tell these stories in a meaningful way. I was on this podcast last night, and the fellow who was interviewing me was like, "You guys need to make TikTok, comics." And I was like, I can't even. Like, please don't say that to me again. But at the same time, it's true. We have to reach kids where they're at. The comics are beautiful. They're fun. They're engaging. Dan Goldman can just pack a punch with one comic. And the combo of like having survivors who worked directly with me as I was writing the short stories, giving that to him, having our UNITAS team, including other survivors, really make sure the materials were grounded in the realities of the situation was so gratifying. And then just seeing them come to life. I mean, we're really seeing kids and parents and teachers access them, because me doing this panel, like the people who are here on this call at 8 o'clock tonight listening to me talk about sextortion, like but most people aren't going to do that, but they might listen to a comic. So that's really kind of where we're at.
Awesome. And then Jane is asking this question, I think is probably on all of our minds, especially those of us who are parents, of how do you recommend framing these initial conversations with young people? You've talked a lot about building trust. You've talked a lot about kind of creating space, safe and brave space. What are some of those tips and strategies that you can share with us for starting those conversations with young people?
So I bet everyone here on this conversation has heard the person who's gotten mad at them say, "It's not what you said, it's how you said it." Well, that's actually really true. So when you're talking to a young person, keep in mind a couple of things. And if there are young people in this call, I'm so sorry for what I'm about to say, but you actually don't have long-term thinking skills yet. You're getting there. It's not your fault. But when you're talking to a young person, it's about being repetitive. It's about saying over and over again, I care about you. I'm concerned about you. There's this thing that I'm wondering if it might be impacting your life. And it's really open-ended questions. It's, tell me more what's happening right now. Tell me a little bit about what you were thinking last night when I saw that you were, upset at dinner. Or I saw that you were kind of like zoning out in class, and like normally you're so engaged. Is there just something on your mind? I'd love to hear about it. Like, I'm here for you. So it's really about that connection. And again, you may not get a good response right off the bat. And you may not get any response, but it's about being consistent and modeling that behavior. Liz, you and I were talking earlier about what I call the magical and word. So, if you have a young person, say you're a teacher and you have a young person acting out in class, or they're just acting different, they're dressing different, they're being reclusive, they're not talking to their friends, they're trying to be on their phone, it's just different. You can say, I've seen that there's some things going on that are making it harder for you to learn. And you seem distracted, and I care about you. Do you know how mind-boggling that is? Because you just didn't use the but word. You're not saying, but I need you to get back to class, but I need you to do your work, but I've noticed this. You're saying, and, which includes, it brings someone in. I can promise you it works really well, both on kids and adults. Try it in your workplace. But it's also really important to understand when you're talking to kids, they're used to being on the defensive. They're used to wanting control and not having it. So it's about giving them control and saying, this is I know that there's something going on, and I want to create a space for you to be able to talk about it. Let's figure out what that looks like together. Now, if you are a mandated reporter and a young person discloses a situation of abuse or exploitation, you are going to have to make that report. And we can talk a little bit about that as well, because you do have to keep kids safe, but you can often find ways in which they will want to do that with you. But front-ending that support, creating that safe space is really vital.
And how about with younger kids? So I mean, and you've mentioned, I mean, kids. I think we both have kindergartners, Andrea, and like, you know, the idea of kind of starting to plant the seeds of those conversations with my daughter right now feels a little daunting to me because she's just so young. So are there ways that we can start to build that kind of trust and build that kind of openness with our when our kids are young?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, like you and I are probably in the same age group where there was a lot of like good touch, bad touch conversation when we were kids, and like stranger danger. So you kind of like, we're talking about sextortion tonight, so we're talking about online exploitation. A lot of that now translates to online. Like I like to, not like, but I share this story often, where I had a very young cousin who came to visit me here in DC. She's from a small Texas town where I grew up, and she wanted to be a cool cat and be in the city. And late one night I went up to go to the bathroom, and I heard a man talking to her. Well, I happen to know her dad passed some years before, and so it was not a man that should be talking to her. And so it was so in my conversation with her afterwards, after I suggested to him to not bother my cousin anymore, I sat her down and was like, hey, you know, as an adult, I love you and I care about you and you're super fun. I would not be FaceTiming you at 1 o'clock in the morning though, because I know that you need sleep and you need to go to school and you need your, you know, to get your rest. And I wouldn't do that. So it's about like helping younger kids understand like what are normal ways that an adult might engage. Also, because a lot of predators will pretend to be a young person their age, you know, letting them know like, and this probably to some people sounds drastic, but if my daughter is 6, so she's not really online yet in that way, but when she is, I'm going to let her know, like, even if little Susie, who we all know is the cutest thing ever from your kinder class, sends you a little message to join some game, Candy Crush or whatever, I'm actually going to call Susie's parents and say, like, this profile, is this Susie's profile? Because predators will make fake profiles. Now, does that make my daughter mad? To be totally honest, I don't care, because I'm not here to be her BFF. I'm here to be her parent. So, and if she's mad at me, it only lasts 5 minutes because she's 6. So, you know, I feel like I'll be fine. But it's really about helping kids understand you're there to protect them. And no matter what, if someone tries to make them do something or tries to trick them into sending a photo, it's never okay. Never send a photo. But also, if you do, if you feel like that's something that you chose to do and you wanted to, it's never your fault. It's never your fault that someone else forced you to do something like that. And so it's creating that sense of like, you can come in and give me a hug and we can talk about this and we'll figure out together, and you're not in trouble. We will do this together as a team. But it's really educating kids that what happens online might feel like it couldn't touch them, but it can. And so those are some of the strategies. I know I'm totally gearing up for like when I'm going to have to talk to my 6-year-old. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and let's see. Okay, and we have a couple questions about reporting too. One around online service providers, so game companies and social media companies, sort of being proactive partners and helping to stop possible sex trafficking. But then also, I think Nicole has a question around just mandatory reporting and if you have suspicions but not full disclosure. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, okay. So we're going to start with the, online providers. So in my past life, one of my sports was going after a company called Backpage.com that was involved in selling kids. But a lot of the companies we're talking about now really don't feel like they have a responsibility to police content. So there's something called the Communications Decency Act, which had protected online publishers like TikTok Facebook, Instagram, from the content that their users produce. But there have been efforts by some of these companies, and I'll call it Twitter's actually been like super proactive and amazing about this. Their head of security is a former National Center for Missing and Exploited Children employee. But those companies, really need to be understanding of like, what are the indicators and how to block predators. But the truth of the matter is, online predators can create new IP addresses. They can create new profiles. The way that we're going to stop this is empowering kids, parents, teachers, and communities with the information they need to spot the signs and to stop the exploitation before it happens. Because if we're at the point where we need to make a report to these companies, which should be done and they should be responsible, we're already at a point though where a kid's been exploited. So, and that's just kind of a revolving door. So again, not to go too dark, but I was on a call with some FBI folks recently talking about the fact that they were seeing cases of kids who were exploited when they were 6, 7, or 8, and now they're 18, 19, 20, and they're exploiting their siblings because it's just that cycle of abuse. And that really struck, I'm not immune to knowing that information, but it really struck me. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to evolve into the mandated reporting. So everybody has different requirements, but if you suspect, so say you're a teacher and you suspect a kid in your class is going through something, you actually can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, whose number happens to be burned in my brain. It's 1-888-3737-888. Again, 1-888-3737-888. You can call anonymously or not. You can field questions. You can get connected to local resources. You can talk about what you're seeing, indicators. You can also contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is 1-800-THE-MISSING, I believe. And they have resources for parents, support groups for parents. They have educational guides. And then here at UNITAS, we also have a 101 on our website that really breaks down the issue of trafficking in a very detailed way. And so, as we're rolling out our education materials, we are really dedicated to making sure that information reflects what are the obligations that we have to keep kids safe. But oftentimes people feel like they're going to break a kid's trust when they make a mandated report. And there are ways to do that can minimize that. But the bottom line is, you having a problem with that kid being upset with you versus that kid being exploited for an extended period of time, it's a no-brainer. You've got to make that call. And maybe that first step is anonymous, but I firmly believe, we got to think about who's the adult in the room and that these kids need us. So hopefully that, answers that question a little bit. And one other thing I wanted to add, sorry, Liz, is particularly girls, but boys too are often, their worth, their self-value is often minimized, and they think about things like brushing their teeth, or brushing their hair, eating their vegetables, or doing their jumping jacks is like all vital things, right? To be a kid, to take care of yourself. We don't often talk about kids' emotional health, their emotional well-being. So, the bullying, the isolation that Reiley felt, the sense of isolation, those were all indicators that she was emotionally hurting and not feeling taken care of. And that's what led to Andy exploiting her. So when we're looking at our own kids, when we're looking at our own classrooms and families, we need to think about the emotional health and the emotional integrity of the kids, and telling them like that's just as important as brushing your teeth and brushing your hair. If someone's hurting your feelings, you're feeling isolated, you're feeling taken advantage of, or you're not sure what someone online is saying to you, just as if you would say my tooth hurts or my eyes twitching or I don't feel good, you can come to your parent or your teacher and say, my heart doesn't feel so good right now. This is what's bothering me. And I think that's just at the heart of what we need to be teaching kids they can do.
So speaking of can-dos, when we were talking earlier, Andrea, you were saying, I think kind of easy to get into this, like, don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. But the message that I think UNITAS is really getting across, which I think is really powerful, is this really empowering message that there are things that you can do as a young person. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about some of those can-dos.
Yeah, so I'll reframe, thank you. So you know, a lot of the conversation around trafficking is like, you know, don't have your live cam on, don't have your location services on, don't talk to strangers, don't share sexualized photos. All true. However, every time you're closing one of those doors for a kid, we need to be thinking about, okay, those are the can'ts, but what are the can do's? You can talk to a trusted adult. Find that trusted adult, teacher, a parent, a cousin, that weird, you know, uncle of yours that everybody makes fun of, but is actually really supportive. You know, finding that one person that you can trust to talk to, empowering yourself as a kid to know these issues and start talking to your peers about it. One of the things we're working on at UNITAS is a peer-to-peer guide, again, using these comics so that kids can talk to other kids, because that is a way to convey information that's credible. You know, you think about, this is a silly example, but say your house was broken into and you were feeling like really violated about that. It feels really bad. And you go to a police station to make the report, and there's someone there who's like, yeah, that happened to me a few years ago. And this is what I've been through. Or, yeah, you know, I'm always worried about my house getting broken into because someone down the street had their house broken into. You're going to listen, you're going to pay attention. And so, you know, helping kids understand, like, as peers, we can actually educate each other. We can actually support each other. Or you can look up this information. You can reach out for support to a local organization who's offering services to kids who are kind of questioning. You know, I think those can-dos are really important. For kids who don't feel comfortable necessarily, if you're a teacher and you know you have a student who may or may not be at risk and you're worried and you don't think that they're necessarily talking to their parents, giving them the opportunity to have a can-do where they can talk to a counselor, they can talk to their favorite teacher. You know, I think those are really important things.
Trying to think of some of the, I know we have precious little time left. So I definitely want to end with the sort of where can we go to learn more and what are, you know, sort of those things. But I think we might have time for one more question, which is just sort of around, and I know you've covered some of this, but just some signs that something's wrong, some signs to some indicators that we might need to kind of push in and be that trusted adult, is sort of part A, and then part B is, I think part A is actually big enough. So if you can kind of talk about some things that both for younger students or for younger children, for older children, you know, what are those things that we can be on the lookout for to know that we need to step in to those conversations?
Yeah, so and I'm going to start this probably a little unexpectedly, but a few years ago I was at this you know, conversation training with a group of women, like an international group of women, and talking about online exploitation and sextortion and how many trafficking victims, survivors I've met their trafficker online, met their exploiter online. And one of the women was like, that's just crazy. You know, why would you like talk to some stranger online? It's like, I was feeling sassy. So I was like, okay, show of hands. How many of you met your husband online? How many of you do online dating? The truth of the matter is, like, we all meet people online. We all have these virtual connections. There's nothing wrong with that. The thing is, though, that someone who's going to exploit a young person or anyone, they're going to start to push them to do things they wouldn't normally do. So when you're talking about really young kids, we're talking about wanting to close your door when you're playing your online chat games. I have a young one. She gives no poodles about closing her door when she's doing anything. I can't even get her to close the door to go to the bathroom. So, which I really wish she would. But, you know, starting to see those little behaviors in kids of secrets, you know, trying to hide their computer, trying to hide the information, you know, turning the volume down, wanting to use a headset. You know, they're little, but they're sneaky. So, you know, figuring out like, oh, these are new behaviors. For an older kid, it's, are they suddenly always on their phone? Are they hiding their phone? Are they dressing different? Are they eating differently? Are they no longer talking to the friends and people they used to talk to? Are their grades drastically changing? Are their interests drastically changing? Are they trying to stay out late? I mean, these are all things, like I said earlier, they may not be indicative of trafficking or exploitation or sextortion, but if you as the adult, be you a parent, a teacher, an advocate, if you have an instinct that something is wrong, something's probably wrong. So getting to it now before it becomes something truly awful would be great. If it's already in that space of sextortion and trafficking, it's really important to reach out and look for those red flags. When we talk about sex trafficking, we often talk about, you know, other hygiene and branding of tattoos and things that we'll get into in some of our subsequent conversations, hopefully. But when we're talking about sextortion, we're talking about how someone's trying to conceal their online world, how they're dressing, how they're acting, you know, more secretive. And some of the flags to look for before that, you know, the bullying, the feeling of isolation at school, you're looking at those vulnerabilities and figuring out, like, you can't keep kids safe from everything. I wish you could, but saying like, hey, I've noticed that things, you know, seem to be a bit of a struggle right now. I want to hear, you know, how you're doing, and finding those outlets. And then so for introverts, just not to get super off topic, but introverts and extroverts act differently to an intervention like that. An introvert might be more responsive to you sitting there and saying like, let's just sit together and like watch this movie or do some, you know, do this art project, something that they have an interest in. And then as that's progressing, say, you know, by the way, I've just kind of noticed like something seems a little off with you. But sometimes that, you know, instead of the direct, like, hey, what's going on? And trying to find some way to engage that kid in an activity they like, and then having that conversation can be really meaningful. But, you know, figuring out what they're responsible for. And obviously, I feel like everyone on this call is going to know this already, but the why didn't you tell me sooner conversation, don't do that. If you can help yourself, you will be emotional, but, you know, as someone who's also experienced trauma, the question of why didn't you just leave, or I just thought you were so much smarter than that, like that stuff doesn't go over very well. So it's really about like, you know, saying like, wow, I'm really appreciating that you're sharing this with me, and I want to learn more, and let's figure out a way together to make sure you feel safe and heard. And that's, to me, that's at the core of it.
All right, well, we have 3 minutes left. So Andrea, tell us where we can go to learn more, because
Yes,
we know that this is not all of it. So where can we learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to start with the fact that, you know, letting kids know, you know, I'm your teacher, I'm your parent, I'm here for you. That consistent daily messaging is so important and so critical. But, you know, taking a step further, again, there's the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-3737-888. Just go ahead and plug that in your phone. You can get a lot of resources and information there. You can go to UNITAS and learn a lot more in-depth information about the issues and our resources in 101 section. You can go to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to get help for parents who are struggling with kids in recovery, for, you know, fielding situations of potential abuse and exploitation. They have just phenomenal resources at the National Center. It's not just about kids who are missing, but it's also about kids who are exploited. You can also learn a lot at Thorn. I can't remember if it's We Are Thorn or thorn.org. I will follow up with that. But they have a lot of information for kids and for parents. And then finally, you can make reports to your local FBI office if you're suspecting something, but oftentimes people feel more comfortable starting out with these hotlines. And then if it's around, you know, potentially what the young person feels is an intimate relationship, and they think, you know, the way that Reiley thought Andy was a boyfriend, Love is Respect has a chat line, loveisrespect.org, and that chat line can help them break down what's the difference between a relationship and an exploitative environment. But those are some of my go-tos and some of what UNITAS uses, but there's certainly a lot more. And you know, I just think that, you know, anyone who's here tonight obviously is proactive and wanting to work on this issue. So I appreciate all of you being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing all this. This is amazing. And I feel like you guys do such a great job of not only telling stories in a really powerful way, but giving people really, really concrete information and strategies to walk away with. I feel like I learned so much.
I love working with you guys. And, you know, I am just one of many with my team, with Lamont and Tanya and Todd and Catherine and many survivors who helped create these materials. So I'm just the representative tonight, but I love being a part of it.
And thank you to everybody who came and participated and shared questions and just shared your time and your energy and your interest in this. We'll be following up with an email soon in the next couple days with links for how to find more information, with the numbers that Andrea shared, with a recording of this webinar too. So if you want to share this out with somebody who wasn't able to join you tonight on this, let's share this, let's get this out into the world, and links to find all of those comics, because there's 10 of them, correct?
Well, there's 4 right now.
There's
and
4
we're
right now.
working on the rest. So, and I am doing, for folks who want to follow our next comic right now, we have one talking about child labor exploitation in the US called CandyCon. So you can go to UNITAS Official on Instagram, and every day I'm posting one of the panels about Leo and educating on that topic. So that'll be something that folks can continue to learn from. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank y'all so much. Andrea, thank you again. Thanks all the other folks from UNITAS who joined as well. We're so happy we were able to co-host this with you guys. Thank you so much for being our partner.
Everybody stay safe and healthy, and reach out if you have questions or need support. Have a lovely night. Bye.
Yeah, bye you guys.